All right, welcome to the Story of the Old Testament, session 10. So tonight we're going to be covering what in our English Bibles is 4 books, but was originally 2 books. We're going to be looking at Samuel and Kings. And remember, I mentioned this last week, the only reason that we have 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings and really 1st and 2nd Chronicles, it has nothing to do with what's in them or the content or the authorship. It has everything to do with the fact that when they translated these books from Hebrew into Greek, they were a whole lot longer. Probably because Hebrew doesn't use vowels and Greek does, and so just the sheer volume of the text was greater. And so when you have these very long books, they would have been extraordinarily long scrolls, and so they just kind of cut them in half so that they were more manageable physically. So that's why we have 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. And these are 2 very, very important books as we work our way through the history of Israel, the history of redemption. So if you remember, we started last week with, or we finished rather, last week with the book of Judges. And it looks like once again my audio has pooped out on us. And I'm just going to switch. Alright, there we go. Sorry about that. I keep trying with my lapel mic and it keeps letting me down. I don't know why. But anyway, we finished last week talking about Judges, and the end of Judges was a pretty dismal picture. I mean, what does the last verse in the book say? It says, "In those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did whatever seemed right to him, or everyone did what was right in his own eyes." There is this realization that things are pretty bad in Israel, and maybe, just maybe, there's hope of a king who would help steer them in the right direction. And in fact, that's kind of the question that Samuel seeks to answer, right? Who can rescue us from the mess that we're in? Who can rescue Israel from the mess that they have created and caused for themselves? And we see the answer in a temporary fashion, and then we're pointed at the end of Kings, we're pointed to the true and lasting answer. Before we go any further, though, I do want to point you in the direction. I like to do this because I am not this smart on my own. I rely heavily on resources, and so whenever I find a good resource, I want to share it with you. And so one of the ones that I have used for this lesson is called Dominion and Dynasty, a Theology of the Hebrew Bible, right there, by Stephen Dempster. This is from a series called New Studies in Biblical Theology, edited by D.A. Carson. Very good. Like you see how thick it is. It's short. If you're interested in this sort of thing, these are great resources to have, and this covers the entire Old Testament. So we're going to draw some on that tonight. So who's going to rescue Israel from the mess that they have created? Well, here's kind of a rough outline of the book of Samuel, and we're going to do like we did last week and the week before. We're going to try to hit some highlights and some themes. We're just not going to be able to dig in like would be really fun. I mean, we could spend an entire season, do an entire study just on Samuel, but we're gonna kind of get that bird's eye 30,000 foot view and pick up on a couple things. So, rough outline. So we go from corrupt judges, or really in the beginning of Samuel, from corrupt priest to corrupt king. That's sort of how we start off. There's a transition from the time of the judges to the time of the monarchy. The first 8 chapters really of 1 Samuel kind of describe this transition period between the time of the judges and the time of the kings. After that, you have this question, who will be king? And we see the contrast given to us between Saul, and we're going to talk more in depth about this in a little bit, but we see that contrast between Saul, the first king, and then David, the second and truthfully greatest king of Israel. The rise of David and the restoration of Israel comes next. That's the heart of the book of Samuel. So if you took 1st and 2nd Samuel and put them back together the way they were, the heart of that, the meat of it, is the story of David. Then you have David's fall, and that's the Bathsheba affair. We'll again sort of see how that plays out later on. The consequences of David's sin, we see the unraveling of his kingdom, and then the good and the bad is a summary of his kingdom. And I'm grateful for Daniel Hayes, who put that outline together. That's not my own. That is his from the other book that we've been using a whole lot. So let's kind of begin at the beginning. Good thing. Let's begin at the beginning of Samuel, and it starts off, and after you've read Judges, it kind of is like, what's going on here? Because you have this seemingly random story of a guy and his 2 wives going to Shiloh, which is where the tabernacle was, to worship. And this is the story of Hannah. And of course, Hannah is one of Elkanah's 2 wives, and she's barren. And this is causing all kinds of strife because Peninnah, or Peninnah, the other wife, is just merciless towards Hannah. And so Hannah cries out to the Lord. She's there at the tabernacle, and she's crying out to the Lord. Eli, the priest, thinks, who is this woman? What's going on? He basically says, if you're going to be drunk somewhere else. And she says, I'm not drunk. I'm praying. And so Eli basically says, well, listen, may it be done to you as you're praying. God's going to grant you a child. And indeed, he does. And that child's name is Samuel. So her prayer, Hannah's prayer, and Dempster points this out, and I think this is very insightful in Dominion and Dynasty, that Hannah's prayer becomes almost the lens through which we are supposed to read the rest of Samuel. And in fact, I think the argument could easily be made that in many ways you read all of the Old Testament and really all of Scripture through this kind of lens. Okay, but he says, and it's all fancy academic. He says this gives us a syntax. This gives us a grammar, a way of reading the story that is told to us in the book of Samuel. So let's look at her prayer for just a few moments. So this is 1 Samuel chapter 2. It says, Hannah prayed, "My heart rejoices in the Lord. My horn is lifted up by the Lord. My mouth boasts over my enemies because I rejoice in your salvation. There's no one holy like the Lord. There is no one besides you. And there's no rock like our God. Do not boast so proudly or let arrogant words come out of your mouth. For the Lord is a God of knowledge and the actions are weighted." It's interesting. Let me pause right here because this is fascinating. In the language, that word arrogant in verse 3 is something like Geboah in Hebrew, and that's probably not how it's pronounced. But it means it's basically tall. It's repeated twice, tall, or high and mighty. It's saying don't be arrogant. Don't think of yourself as bigger and taller than you actually are. Now that theme is going to come into play throughout the rest of the book. So the bows of the warriors, verse 4, are broken, but the feeble are clothed with strength. Those who are full hire themselves out for food, but those who are starving hunger no more. The woman who is childless gives birth to 7, but the woman with many sons pines away. The Lord brings death and gives life. He sends some down to Sheol, and he raises others up. The Lord brings poverty and gives wealth. He humbles and exalts. He raises the poor from the dust and lifts the needy from the trash heap. He seats them with noblemen and gives them a throne of honor. For the foundations of the earth are the Lord's. He has set the world on them. He guards the steps of the faithful ones, but the wicked perish in darkness. For a person does not prevail by his own strength. Those who oppose the Lord will be shattered. He will thunder in the heavens against them. The Lord will judge the ends of the earth. He will give power to his king. Listen to the messianic hope. He will lift up the horn of his anointed. So you have this hymn, this beautiful hymn that Hannah sings in praise and thanksgiving to the Lord, who has heard her prayer and answered her prayer and given her a son. And the fascinating thing is what you see in her prayer is this, the unexpected or the nobody. There is a series of reversals where the nobodies end up being used and blessed and exalted, and the somebodies, by the world standards, end up being brought low. And so Dempster says this is how you read Samuel, and think about it. And so what we're going to see in the rest of the book is God acting through a series of dramatic reversals. Hannah is barren. She can't have children. But God gives her children. There's that reversal, and that's what Hannah is singing about. Samuel, her son, is not a Levite, but he carries out tabernacle worship and is a prophet. So he's doing things that you would expect Levites to be doing, but he's not a Levite. Saul is kingly, right? He's tall, okay? Yet he fails almost immediately to serve Israel as a godly king. David is the youngest son of Jesse, and remember, and I think we can kind of conceptualize this today with the way royalty passes on succession, and typically the succession goes to the eldest, the oldest, in these cases, the oldest son. Well, here's David, who's the youngest of 7, and yet that's who God chooses to be king. And also, he was not very impressive physically. All right? Solomon was not the firstborn son of David, just like David wasn't the firstborn son of Jesse. Nor is Solomon Saul's grandson. So remember, David married Saul's daughter. And because Saul was king and his daughter was David's first wife, you would expect that the first son from her would become king. Not the case. In fact, she doesn't have kids. Yet Solomon is chosen to be the successor for his father David. What we see, and we see it in Samuel just vividly, but we do see it throughout the rest of scriptures, is that it seems like God just gets a kick out of using nobodies to carry out his will. And like that right there, that ought to be, that could preach all on its own. So this helps us as, this is at the beginning of Samuel, and that kind of gives us a hint how the whole rest is going to go. So in the opening chapters we find that Samuel, who the book is named after, we find that Samuel is the main character. Okay, of course he's Hannah's son. He gets dedicated to the Lord, and so he works in the temple. And as he grows up in the temple, literally, and then after Eli and his sons, who are wicked and awful, like they are. So Eli, he could have been better, but his two sons, and I think they're Hophni and Phinehas, they were typical of the era of the judges. They were, you do whatever you want. There are just some awful stories told about his sons. They would, when people brought offerings to the tabernacle, they would pick the parts that they wanted from the offering and get real picky about it. Like they would put it all into a pot, and they would stick a fork in there, and whatever came out was theirs. They were completely denying the instructions that God had given his priest back in Leviticus, back in Exodus. They were doing things their own way. And in fact, it says that if people would bring their offering, instead of being satisfied with the portion that God had set aside for the priest, they would say, we want that part. And if the person who brought the offering said, but God said for you to get this part and to do it they would say, no, you give that to us or we're going to take it from you by force. These guys were completely corrupt. They were sleeping with women who were outside of the tabernacle, and it was just, again, it was like, you can tell there's no difference between what we see in the book of Judges and what we see with Eli and his sons. Samuel comes out of that and kind of begins this new era of people who are going to follow the Lord. Like he's beginning that process of restoring and bringing Israel back to where they belong. So he like I said, he's kind of the main character in these first few chapters. He is the first of the prophets in the way that we think of a prophet. Moses in some ways acted in the style, in the way of a prophet, but Samuel he's the last judge, and he's the first prophet, and he's also the one who anoints the kings of Israel. He inaugurates the monarchy. He starts the monarchy off for Israel. And like I said, he begins to recover the true worship of Yahweh. Now the thing is, Samuel actually, he kind of quits pretty early on in the narrative. Once the monarchy is established, because that he had served his purpose. And so that's where I want us to turn now, real briefly. Again, we're going to just try to cover some ground. One of the main themes that we see in Samuel is this contrast, as I mentioned earlier, between Saul and David. And the contrast is complete. Like they have nothing in common. So Saul is the one that Israel wanted to be king. Hey, we want this guy. It wasn't necessarily who God wanted to be king, but he was tall, right? The Bible says he was head and shoulders, so he's about a foot taller than anybody else in Israel. So if the average height, and this is what I've read, I wasn't there, but the average height back then in Israel was just over 5 feet. So Saul would have been maybe just over 6 feet. But still, being that much taller than everybody is, that's a significant advantage, especially if you're going to be this warrior king who's going to fight battles and lead people to victory in battle. He's handsome, but he also cowers in the face of adversity, in the face of Goliath. Okay, and listen, I know Goliath was huge. Depending on who you read, some would say he was almost 7 feet tall. Some say he's over 9 feet tall. The guy was tall. He would have had to duck to come through the door no matter what. I had a friend who is 6'9" tall, and I'm 6'1", and 6'9" seems like a mile high. Okay, you know, that would be tall enough. That would be a giant. Then add 3 feet to that, he certainly was a giant. But here's Saul, who's supposed to be this warrior king. He's bigger than anybody else in the country, and he's the one who's supposed to stand up to the enemies of Israel. And instead, he's just like, no, forget that. He was equipped. He was called. He had all the right, the skills necessary to do this, and he chickened out, right? He's supposed to be the warrior king, and he's sitting back in his tent wondering offering prizes and money and daughters to whoever can defeat Goliath. We also know that he may have started off good, but he very quickly stopped following the Lord. And it's interesting to note that the Ark of the Covenant plays very little role. It's not a character in the story during Saul's reign like it is during David's. Might be trying to tell us something there. So David is God's choice for a king. And the Lord had actually given Israel instructions on how to select a king and what that king is supposed to look like all the way back in Deuteronomy. So if you look in Deuteronomy chapter 17, it says this, and I think this is fascinating. Deuteronomy 17, starting in verse 14. When you enter the land the Lord your God is giving you, take possession of it, live in it, and say, I will set a king over me like all the nations around me. You are to appoint over you the king the Lord your God chooses. Who chooses the king? God chooses the king. They don't choose the king. God chooses the king. Who chose Saul? The people did. Who chose David? God did, right? Appoint a king from your brothers. You are not to set a foreigner over you or one who is not of your people. However, he must not acquire many horses for himself or send the people back to Egypt to acquire many horses, for the Lord has told you, you are never to go back that way again. He must not acquire many wives for himself, so that his heart won't go astray. He must not acquire very large amounts of silver and gold for himself. When he is seated on his royal throne, he is to write a copy of this instruction for himself on a scroll in the presence of the Levitical priests. I think that's cool. God says the king is to get his own paper and his own pen, and he's gotten to copy this down for himself. He is to remain with him, and he's to read from it all the days of his life, so that he may learn to fear the Lord his God, to observe all the words of his instruction, and to do these statutes. Then his heart will not be exalted above his countrymen. He will not turn from this command to the right or to the left, and he and his sons will continue reigning many years in Israel. God gives them instructions on selecting a king. Well, God's going to select a king, and what to do. What are some things this king is to be held accountable for? All right, they don't really do that, but in Saul they don't do that. But then David comes along. He is appointed and anointed by God to be king. Not one person selected David. Nobody would have selected David. They would have selected Saul. And what was he? He was a shepherd. Rather than trying to kill Saul, he refuses to harm him, even though he had every human right. Remember, Saul is actively trying to kill David because he knows what's going to happen. He knows that David is the true anointed king, and Saul's going to try to kill him. David has opportunity after opportunity to kill Saul, but he doesn't. He stands up to Goliath and kills Goliath, not in his own power, but in the power of Yahweh. Right? You stand there with spear and sword and shield. I come to you in the name of the living God. Right? It's interesting too to look at the correlation between 1 Samuel 17 when David kills Goliath and 1 Samuel chapter 5 when a really crazy thing happens. So Phinehas and Hophni have taken the Ark of the Covenant into battle with the Israelites. This battle is not going well against, I think it's the Philistines. Let me go back and double check. Yeah, so they're battling the Philistines, and they say, hey, this isn't going well. The battle, we're not winning. What gives? What should we do? We should get the Ark of the Covenant and send it out in front of us, because that's what we do. The Ark is magic. The Ark does what when we put the Ark in front of us, God is obligated to do things. Wrong answer. God does as he pleases. Okay? Anyway, they lose the battle. The Ark of the Covenant gets captured by the Philistines, and they do what you normally would do if you lived in the ancient Near East and you defeated somebody, and that is they took the spoils of war, i.e. the Ark of the Covenant, and they took it to the temple of one of their main gods, Dagon. Because in those times when you defeated an enemy, it not only spoke about you and your ability to conquer, but it was also, in their mind, was our God is also superior to yours. Because if your God was superior, you wouldn't have lost the battle. He would have intervened. So they take the Ark of the Covenant and they put it in the temple of Dagon. The next morning they come in, and this huge statue of Dagon has fallen face down in front of the Ark of the Covenant. Right? Who is Dagon bowing down before now? Who really won? Okay? So they're like, this is no good. They put it back up. The next day they come in, the statue of Dagon has fallen down in front of the Ark of the Covenant again, and its head has come off and its hands had come off. So again, in those days, often, and it's horrific, I certainly don't recommend this, but a victorious army would take a defeated king and they would cut off his head and his hands. And so here's a picture of their God that they thought was superior, and what they find out is that he's actually inferior to the God of Israel, to Yahweh. And so they pack up the ark, they put it on a cart, and they send it on, and the ark goes off back to Israel. And so we see that replayed in 1 Samuel 17, where here is this seemingly insignificant shepherd boy, and he's facing off against perhaps the greatest warrior of the time. Big, 9 feet tall, spear like a weaver's beam, and so on. And he takes him out with a rock. And what does he do? He falls face down in front of him. David immediately unsheaths Goliath's own sword, cuts his head off, and the victory is won. Yahweh is the one producing the victory in all of these cases. Yahweh fights for them, right? David also restores authentic worship and puts God at the center of Israelite life. He brings the ark back to Jerusalem. David even begins to concoct a plan to build a house for the Lord, which gets put on hold. But he's restoring authentic worship. In every way, David is presented as the perfect king who would rescue Israel from their mess. Like, who's going to rescue us from this place that we're in? Saul's not going to do it. The one who God chooses is going to do it. God's anointed is going to rescue us, and he does. Like, everything is looking great. It's victory on top of victory. It's peace and prosperity and all of this. And then you get to Bathsheba. And David's sin with Bathsheba is really the undoing for the rest of his reign. The narrative from the point that he sins with Bathsheba and by having Uriah murdered, from that point forward, it's never the same. This glorious, victorious king that we see in the beginning, he ends up running. He has his own son who is trying to rebel and take the kingdom from him, and it's a real fall from grace. Now, again, we know that David repents and that there is forgiveness for the sins that he had committed. All right, but there are still consequences that he had to deal with from those sins, and that's true for us as well. Like, we can be forgiven and restored to the Lord and still have to deal with some hard consequences of our sins in this life. But the message is clear that Samuel, the book of Samuel, is trying to get across, and that is that the human king, we thought he was perfect, but he turns out to be imperfect. He turns out to be like us. There still is a need for another king to do it right. Samuel, though, does end with an interesting story that I want to kind of hit on before we get to Kings. So at the very end of what we would call 2 Samuel, David, this is chapter 24 of 2 Samuel, David takes a census that he's not supposed to take. He wants to be like everybody. He wants to be like all the other kings. All the other kings are taking census. We should take a census. Israel's kings aren't supposed to find their comfort and all in numbers. Their strength comes from the Lord. So he takes a census that is sinful, and God gives him three choices. The prophet Gad comes to him, and it says, verse 13, so Gad went to David, told him the choices, and asked him, do you want 3 years of famine to come to your land, to flee from your foes 3 months while they pursue you, or to have a plague in your land for 3 days? Now consider carefully what answer I should take back to the one who sent me. So here it is, David. Because you've done this, discipline is coming your way. You want 3 years of famine, 3 months of running away from your enemies, or 3 days of plague. Watch how David answers this. And again, he may have fallen from grace. He may not have been the David that we see at the beginning of Samuel, but he still has got a heart for God. And he still has an incredible amount of wisdom. David answered Gad, I have great anxiety. Yeah. Please let us fall into the Lord's hands. What? Like, that's the most dangerous place to be. You have no idea. Like, God can just, in an instant, he can wipe you out. Let us fall into the Lord's hands. Why? Because his mercies are great. but don't let me fall into human hands. David looks at the disciplinary action that has the greatest potential for destruction, and he chooses that one. Why? Because he knows that God is merciful, and he would rather throw himself into the hands of a God that is absolutely able to bring untold wrath and destruction on people, that he could speak them out of existence. But he would rather throw himself into the hands of a God who is merciful, who he knows is merciful, than to put himself in the hands of men. That's incredible. So, what happens? A plague is sent. So the Lord sent a plague on Israel from that morning until the appointed time. And from Dan to Beersheba, look at this, 70,000 men died. This is no small thing. 70,000 people died in 3 days from this plague. Then the angel extended his hand toward Jerusalem to destroy it. So think death angels. Think the angel that God sent to kill the firstborn in all of Egypt. The same imagery here. This angel, this plague angel, is coming, and now he's turned from Dan to Beersheba, and now he's headed toward Jerusalem. But the Lord relented concerning the destruction and said to the angel who was destroying the people, "Enough, withdraw your hand now." The angel of the Lord was then at the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite. Now look at this. This is amazing. Verse 17, David is going to plead with God. When David saw the angel striking the people, he said to the Lord, "Look, I am the one who has sinned. I am the one who's done wrong, but these sheep." Y'all just think about that. Like he's the shepherd. Like he's the shepherd that God chose for his flock. But these sheep, what have they done? Please let your hand be against me and my father's family. David pleads with God. God stops. And the way it reads, the angel stops, and then verse 17 you have David pleading, but it says that when he saw the angel destroying the people, he began to plead. So David's plea to God was before he stopped. All right? Where does the angel stop? The angel stops at the threshing floor of Araunah, who is a Jebusite. Who are the Jebusites? And where is this threshing floor? Well, it's on a hill in a place that we'll call Jerusalem. David buys the threshing floor and he builds an altar on it and offers sacrifice. So here, let's just boil down what's going on here so we see the picture, because this is how Samuel ends. This is what we see of David in 1 Kings is almost irrelevant, other than the fact that he makes sure that Solomon is his successor. But David is effectively dead at the beginning of Kings. So this is how we kind of finish off David's reign. The king, David the king, intercedes for the people of Jerusalem. And here's what it says. This is how Samuel ends. After the king has interceded for the people. This is 2 Samuel 24, end of verse 25. Then the Lord was receptive to the prayer for the land, and the plague on Israel was ended. Y'all, we're given a picture right there of what the true final Davidic king, the one who could really rescue his people out of their mess. We're given a picture of what he's going to do on that same mountain. Just like Abraham and Isaac gives us a picture of what God's going to do, where instead of us having to die on the altar, he provides not a ram, but a lamb. Like, God's geography is incredible. And this picture is just beautiful. And you know what? When Jesus said, "It is finished," and the temple curtain was torn, the Lord was receptive to his prayer. And the plague on his people of sin was ended. Now that's some good stuff. We got a few minutes. We got about 20 minutes left to get through the book of Kings. I appreciate you hanging in there this long. The book of Kings, which again for us is 1st and 2nd Kings, but Kings provides sort of a national history of Israel for this period between David and the exile. All right. Now, 1st and 2nd Chronicles is going to do a similar thing, but we'll talk about it later on. As I just said, David is essentially dead at the beginning of the book of Kings. He's you can tell he's dying, and the last thing he does is confirm Solomon as his successor. So Solomon is going to be the next king in Israel. We know Solomon, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Songs. He was the wisest man ever to live. He had some troubles too, and we'll talk about those. So he starts off well, Solomon does. By the time we get to chapter 8, which Solomon has now built the temple. David planned the temple and collected all of the building materials, and Solomon is able to actually build it. And God says, "Hey, David, you are a man of bloodshed, of war." Solomon, he doesn't really know war. He has a peaceful kingdom by and large. And so he dedicates the temple after it is complete and says this, this is chapter 8 verse 60, "May all the peoples of the earth know that the Lord is God. There is no other." Like, this temple, this is what it's for, that the whole world, that everybody may know that there is a God, and he is unmatched. That's good, right? And you read Solomon's prayer, which is the rest of chapter 8, and it's beautiful, it's incredible. He clearly had a heart for God, but it does not take him long to drift. Okay, by the time you get to chapter 11, it says King Solomon loved many foreign women. Wait a minute. Deuteronomy 17 says he must not acquire many wives for himself, so that his heart won't go astray. King Solomon loved many foreign women, in addition to Pharaoh's daughter. Not good. Moabite, Ammonite, Edomite, Sidonian, and Hittite women from the nations about which the Lord had told the Israelites, "You must not intermarry with them, and they must not intermarry with you." Why? Because God was racist and he didn't like these people? No. Because they will turn your heart away to follow their gods. It was a religious issue. These people were not followers of Yahweh. They didn't believe in Yahweh. They believed in Baal and Dagon and Ashtaroth and all of these, and Molech. That was the problem. It wasn't the fact that they were Hittite or Sidonian. It was the fact that they worshiped these false gods. And God knew that if they started intermingling with them, they were going to go that direction. To these women, Solomon was deeply attached in love. He had 700 wives who were princesses and 300 who were concubines. And they turned his heart away. 700 who were princesses and 300 were concubines. My math is not great, but that adds up to 1,000 women who were intimately involved with Solomon. When Solomon was old, his wives turned his heart away to follow other gods. He was not wholeheartedly devoted to the Lord his God, as his father David had been. Solomon followed Ashtaroth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and Milcom, the abhorrent idol of the Ammonites. Solomon did what was evil in the Lord's sight, and unlike his father David, he did not remain loyal to the Lord. Verse 11 says, Then the Lord said to Solomon, Since you have done this and did not keep my covenant and my statutes which I commanded you, I will tear the kingdom away from you and will give it to your servant. However, I will not do it during your lifetime for the sake of your father David. I will tear it out of your son's hand. Yet I will not tear the entire kingdom away from him. I will give one tribe to your son for the sake of my servant David and for the sake of Jerusalem that I chose. And that points back to 1 Samuel, or hang on, I think it's 2 Samuel. That points back to 2 Samuel chapter 7, which is God's covenant that he makes with David, which is that he would, provide a king for him, that he would, this is when David's going to build a house for the Lord, and God says, no, you're not going to build a house for me, I'm going to build a house for you. And he makes this promise and this covenant with David. And so as a result of that covenant, God's not going to completely annihilate Solomon's line. Those are the results of drifting away from Yahweh. He says, this is your discipline. So in 930 BC, the kingdom of Israel is divided. The northern kingdom, the northern 10 tribes, is called Israel. The southern 2 tribes is called Judah. In Israel, the northern tribes, there were 0 good kings, not even one good king. They all, quote, did evil in the sight of the Lord. And that's where many of the prophets prophesied. And in 723 BC, they were destroyed by Assyria. God carried out the covenant curses from all the way back in Deuteronomy. Follow me, long life in the land. You turn from me, destruction. The southern 2 tribes, Judah, this is where the Davidic dynasty is preserved. So in the north, their kings, they got new kings generally by the new guy killing the old guy. I mean, you had people who were king for 3 months and then they were getting stabbed and somebody else took over. There was no hereditary succession. There wasn't one line that ran through the kings in Israel in the north, but in the southern kingdom of Judah, they always had a king from the Davidic dynasty. So that part, he'll never lack a man on the throne. He didn't. The Davidic dynasty is preserved. There were actually several good kings in the southern kingdoms, 2 of which were Hezekiah and Josiah. And both of those kings were compared to David. None of the other, even the other good ones weren't compared to David, but Hezekiah and Josiah, there had never been a king like him since his father David. Many good things to say about those guys. Unfortunately, Hezekiah's son Manasseh caused the nation, listen to this, to do worse evil than the nations the Lord had destroyed before the Israelites. Yikes. That's some really, really bad evaluation. Thus, in 586 BC, Babylonians capture Jerusalem, they destroy the temple, and take most of the people into captivity. And that's the captivity that we are familiar with Esther, with Daniel, Ezekiel, those prophets and those narratives. Fowler and DeRushi say, from the earliest stages of the Bible, God set forth that human rule would play a central role in his purposes. Human rule, like human government. The book of 1st and 2nd Kings shows how monarchy failed miserably in Israel due to the covenant rebellion of the kings and the people. The failure of the people in 1st and 2nd Kings, the failure of those kings, the ultimate failure of those kingdoms, is directly related to their rebellion against the covenant of God. Prophets do play a significant role in the book of Kings. So remember, Samuel is the first of the prophets. He was the first in a long line. And we don't really hear, Nathan, Gad, we hear bits and pieces in Samuel, but in Kings, man, this is where we're introduced to Elijah and Elisha, and things get real with the prophets. Now, their primary purpose of the prophet, which they were mouthpieces of God, their primary purpose was to call Israel back into their covenant relationship with Yahweh. It was, hey, you're way over there, you need to come back over here to walking in God's ways. All right, you have strayed, let's get back on track. That is primarily what the prophets were all about. Okay, that is the biggest part of their ministry. There are other things, and typically when we think of prophets and prophecy, man, we're like, yeah, that's seeing into the future, and we love that sort of thing. I don't know what the fascination is, but it is I would argue, a common human fascination to know the future. And so we get wrapped up in that stuff really tightly. And that's like 10% of what the prophets in the Bible did. The biggest part of their ministry was come back to Yahweh. You have drifted, come back to Yahweh. Now they would foretell future events on occasion. And when they did, it was with 100% accuracy. Why? Because God, who controls history, had told them what was going to happen. The almighty, all-powerful God said, hey, Elijah, this is what's getting ready to happen. Now go tell them about it. And guess what? It happened every time. They also performed miracles. This is especially true of Elijah and Elisha. Their miracle ministry, if you want to call it that, and I hesitate to because that carries some really negative baggage, but the miracles that they performed were a type of Christ, and we saw so many of the things that Jesus did in his ministry, the healings and miracles that he did, were reflective of those earlier miracles of Elijah and Elisha, and that's on purpose. Like God did that on purpose. So prophets play a big role in 1st and 2nd Kings. This is where you have the Mount Carmel, Elijah facing off with the 450 prophets of Baal, and God raining down fire and all of that. So they're in here. But just to kind of wrap up, Kings is a covenantal evaluation. And that's not my term, that is Fowler and DeRushi's term, but they call it a covenantal evaluation of the kings of Israel and Judah. And so what that means is they are evaluating the kings based on their faithfulness to God's covenant. And one of the easiest ways for us to kind of make that evaluation is based on that Deuteronomy 17 passage that tells us, hey, here's I'm going to choose the king, and then here are things that they need to do. And if you have kings that did that, then you have a good idea that they were being probably faithful to the covenant. If you have kings that steered away from those things that God mentions in Deuteronomy 17, you probably have a bad king. As bad as the news is in the book of Kings, it actually ends on an interesting high note and a hopeful note, which we see that so often in the Old Testament. 2 Kings 25, 27 through 30. And this is how we're going to wrap up tonight. So here's what's happened. Lots of bad kings in Israel, they've been destroyed. Judah, bad king, good king, bad king, good king, bad king, good king, really bad king, captivity. So they've gone to captivity, and Jerusalem has been destroyed, and then the narrative just skips like the entire captivity and says this: on the 27th day of the 12th month of the 37th year of the exile. So it skipped half, a little over half of the exile, of Judah's king Jehoiachin, in the year evil Merodach became king of Babylon, he pardoned King Jehoiachin of Judah and released him from prison. He spoke kindly to him and set his throne over the thrones of the kings who were with him in Babylon. So Jehoiachin changed his prison clothes, and he died regularly in the presence of the king of Babylon for the rest of his life. As for his allowance, a regular allowance was given to him by the king, a portion for each day for the rest of his life. Jehoiachin is pardoned, and he's freed from prison. There's hope, and it reminds us, it is a direct reminder of what God promised back in 1 Kings chapter 11. This is at the end of kind of Solomon's life. Well, here, let me give us a little context. I'll read 1 Kings 11:38. After that, if you obey all I command you, walk in my ways, and do what is right in my sight, in order to keep my statutes and my commands as my servant David did, I will be with you. I will build you a lasting dynasty just as I built for David, and I will give you Israel. Verse 39, I will humble David's descendants because of their unfaithfulness, but not forever. I will humble David's descendants because of their unfaithfulness, but not forever. The exile was the humbling of David's descendants, but not forever. And that's the way Kings ends. Golly, we've been humbled. Jerusalem's destroyed. We're in captivity. But the king has been pardoned. God has not forgotten us and left us here alone. It ends on that fantastically high note. But still, just like Samuel, Kings is letting us know, it's putting us on notice that as good as some of these kings were, as good as David was, he still wasn't perfect. We still needed somebody to rescue us from our mess. And that person, he was coming. Right? So, we will continue our journey through the Old Testament next week, which the plan is to do that, make that available in person if you'd like to meet us then, or you can continue to join us streaming and online. So anyway, thank you for being with us tonight, and I hope you have a great rest of the week.